Okay, I'm going to move on now and ask Margaret Flynn, who I had the pleasure of having dinner with last night, and she's going to share with you some of thoughts, some reflections, some of her experiences, and indeed certainly some of her knowledge, and some considerations for us to take away about our social work practice. So Margaret's details are in the pack. I won't go through all of Margaret's wonderful CV, but I think we're very fortunate to have someone of Margaret's breadth of experience here. And I think over the next 2 days, and it's great that she's staying on to be part of the workshops so that you get to work and listen and engage with Margaret face to face. So thank you very much, Bernard, and I'll now introduce Margaret. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be with you today and tomorrow. Many years ago, I trained as a social worker, and as I've been thinking about what is going to be helpful to say or to talk about this morning and tomorrow, I've asked myself, where did it all begin, and what is it that has nurtured my own skill base? Because as I think back over my career, I think of the inordinate privilege that I've had in working with a phenomenal range of individuals and families, but also professionals. So I have a brother who is a brother-in-law who's a historian, and history is incredibly instructive. Because it familiarises us with events and individuals, but it also warns us. And I think there's personal history as well as individual histories, personal histories, individual histories, and events that teach us an enormous amount. One of my earliest memories, I have a brother with a learning disability, and this is before special schools were fully established and operational in England. He's an older brother, and one of my earliest memories is of standing beside him in the playground as he was being teased. And it's an uncomfortable memory because I could see that the children were dancing around him and teasing him in a way that made him flap his hands. And one of the things that we'd learned to do as siblings was actually not to get him distressed so that he would flap his hands and cover his ears. So it was very hard to see this happening. Now, I'm not suggesting that I was an angel or a saint by any means, but I just knew it was wrong, and I had to stand alongside him. And it seems to me that gave me a glimpse of the importance of standing alongside people, the almost early stages of advocating with and on behalf of people who are not able to do it for themselves. But I emphasise I was no angel, and I gave my brother hell in many other ways, and so did my siblings. But the loyalty that we have now to our brother, there are 3 sisters younger than him, is phenomenal, and we have indeed moved into the spaces left by our parents. And I think one of the challenges that I have experienced throughout my career is the term overprotection. I don't know whether it's used in Ireland as frequently as we deploy it in England and Wales, I have to say, but the term, this family is incredibly overprotective. But there have been times in my brother's life when I regret we were not protective enough. And there's a challenge for all of us as practitioners to ensure that we do not diminish what it is that families can and do offer to their vulnerable relatives. If I fast forward a little bit to my own work, I was fascinated by research. And I had, as a young researcher with a social work background, I secured funding to spend time with adults with learning disabilities who had left some of the long-stay hospitals in the north of England. And those of you who are familiar with the north of England, the hospitals, the big names were Calderstones, Brock Hall. And I met people who had lived in these places. And I wrote about it because I was fascinated that the former residents of these long-stay hospitals valued that which we all value. And I was fascinated that people sat, for example, with their front door keys in their hands. Why? Because they hadn't had keys before. They'd lived on wards. And their aspirations were completely understandable. They wanted to have partners. They wanted to have families. They wanted to have jobs. And yet, services were not designed to nurture any of those possibilities. There aren't very many of us who want to walk on this planet by ourselves, and people were extraordinarily lonely. And I recall too, from that research, that I had 3 offers of marriage. Now, on the basis, I have to say, of, a brief interview or, maybe a couple of hours with people. And while I'd like to think that that says something about my qualities, I can confidently say it says a great deal more about people's loneliness and about people's desire to spend time with individuals who are going to spend time with them and listen to them, pay attention to their experiences. I was fascinated too that on the back of that research, I was asked to do a number of talks to different groups of people. And I thought it was fascinating how to talk to people. And to me, it was just very straightforward. What do you mean, how to talk to people? I quoted people in the research. And yet, as other researchers tended to rely on templates of, well, can we have a satisfaction survey? I think, no, actually, what's the point of a satisfaction survey? We can talk to people. It is one of the most significant things that we can do with people is to pay attention to that which they are telling us. But also when they're telling us that things are going very badly wrong, to take action, the sort of action that makes sense to them as well. So history, as we build our skill base, we must never lose sight of the importance of individuals' histories. One of the things that has always struck me about some of the reviews that I've been privileged to be associated with is that it's only when the balloon goes up, it's only when things have gone very badly wrong, that we start to ask questions about, well, what's this person's capacity? Can they communicate? When in fact we've got shed loads of files about individuals, but we're not asking some very, very important things. Something else that's incredibly important, it seems to me, is asking what makes you feel safe. If I were to ask that question of everybody in this room, we would all say something rather different. I'm quite confident of that. I'm happy to share with you, I actually like to sleep upstairs. And I recall as a youngster going camping and being traumatized by the experience. I wanted to be upstairs. It makes sense to me. That makes me feel safe. We all have a sense of what makes us feel safe. And yet that very straightforward question is so rarely asked of anybody. Now, it can also be abused. If you were particularly minded to give me a hell of a time, you'd send me on camping holidays all the time, would you not? And you'd insist on me living in a bungalow. But we have to check what it is that makes people feel safe. It is an important question to ask, and yet it seems to me that we so very rarely ask about it. An early experience for me, an experience in an event shortly after the research that I did around people living in their own homes, concerned a hostel. At the time, hostels were in vogue in England. They would accommodate probably about 20 adults with learning disabilities, men and women, multi-occupancy rooms, so really not, maybe one notch better than a youth hostel, I guess, but nothing particularly attractive. But these were very typically the next step from some of the long-stay hospitals. And I was invited to undertake a review with a colleague, a director of social services at the time, a review of abuse at this at this hostel. And there was a police investigation, and it emerged that the hostel had accommodated a man who had lived in a long-stay hospital for many years. And he had been discharged to this hostel into a multi-agency room where he sexually assaulted the men with whom he shared this room, and also women who lived in the hostel. And this had gone on for a great deal of time, well over 12 months. And I was fascinated that it was a woman who came to work in the hostel who was responsible for alerting the social services to events at this hostel. She did not have a background in service development. She didn't have a training. She hadn't been trained to be a social worker or a nurse, for example. But she had said, I've brought up a family. I think I've got a lot to offer in terms of skills. I'm interested in helping people. I want to help people, so I want to work in this service. And she had only been in the hostel for around 24 hours. And she got in touch and said, look, there's something badly wrong here and it needs attention. I don't care whether or not they've got learning disabilities, but people are very, very distressed. She took responsibility. She stood out for me because she set an example and she broke the spell over what was the status quo. The status quo was, you know, this just happens. This is what this man does here. And I was really interested that the officer in charge of this particular hostel made the observation when we asked about the fact and extent of the rape of residents at this hostel. She said, oh, no, they weren't raped. And I remember thinking, how can you be so confident? And she said, because nobody screamed. And you think, gosh, are we talking the same language here? And something that I have learned as a professional is, by heck, do we use language that terrifies everybody? But also language that closes off the possibility of us really engaging with people, everyday language. But are we actually talking about exactly the same thing? That was not my definition of rape, but it was hers. And for that reason, she did not see the rape and distress arising from this man's presence at the hostel that this new member of staff did. So taking responsibility is incredibly important. And it's also something that we value. I was fascinated, even travelling yesterday on Ryanair, to see some of the emergent coverage given to the appalling abuse that a black woman received from another passenger. And some people did indeed say, calm down, don't speak out like that. It's incredibly hard to do that, incredibly hard to do it. And certainly in work a little bit of work I've done with whistleblowers, I am fascinated that they stand out. Now, I have to say, when you're over 60, it gets easier. You can't be asked what people think. But it's still very, very difficult to speak out when individuals are being so offensive and when they're yelling at you. It's incredibly hard to do that. I think we learn best in the context in which information is going to be used. And some learning is really transformative. So that hostel for me was incredibly significant. My own experience with Peter, my brother, has been incredibly significant. And there are other things that have really snagged my interest. Safeguarding is a really imperfect art. I wish I could say it was really very straightforward. I wish I could stand up and say, if you listen to this training, if you follow this policy, it'll be cracked. Life is not like that. And in fact, I find it really very disappointing that so much of safeguarding training sorts out, well, this is what physical abuse is, this is what sexual abuse is, this is financial, this is psychological, as though we know what on earth that means that life is not like that, as you know. And in fact, there was some fabulous research done arising from very detailed information gathering. This was in Kent County Council. They were probably one of the first counties in England to really track and develop adult protection and safeguarding. And a researcher at the University of Canterbury, he did some work around the different kinds of abuse, and he asked, and he said, what is the most typical form of abuse? And that's a question I'm going to ask you. What do you think is the most typical form of abuse? Because he looked at all the data in Kent. What do you think is the most typical? Psychological. Yes. What? Any other bids? Neglect. Yes. You see, you're all right, because the most typical form of abuse is all of it. You know, if I'm going to thump you, if I'm really committed to giving you a hell of a time, it won't just be that single first thump. There will have been a development. And I think that's where some of the training around safeguarding is really kind of problematic, isn't it? And in England and in Wales, we now resort to e-learning, which is the least favoured kind of learning that anyone talks about. And yet we still have this division of, you know, this is what different kinds of abuse look like. Now, that's not to suggest that, you know, scamming is connected with everything else. You know, the best of scammers are completely indifferent to the people at the end of the phone, to the people who receive the correspondence that says, you are a millionaire, congratulations. We know that. And they are also completely indifferent to the individuals who go online and want a partner. And they see an image of an implausibly shaped woman or a hunk of an attractive man, and they may believe that they are in communication with such people. And there is a really very humbling account of a woman lecturer who describes just the experience of loneliness following the death of her husband, and she goes online. And then on, I believe on YouTube, she's spoken very honestly about having been ripped off backwards by this implausible figure she believed she was in communication with. You know the patter, you know, it needs 20,000 to release me from the particular jurisdiction that I'm in. You know, horror of horrors, it needs another 10K because I'm ill, and you know the script. These people are wholly unscrupulous, but very focused and driven on money. So the learning about different kinds of safeguarding, but the most typical kind that we're familiar with, is really, really uncomfortable territory. It hinges on oversights and unheeded warnings. We very often talk about learning lessons, and it's a phrase that I think makes families very cynical. You know, you're going to learn the lessons from this. Yeah, right. It seems to me that some of the most effective learning provides some sort of explanation, provides an account of what it is that's happened, because very often that's what we want to know. But mostly it tells you about my learning as a reviewer. I'll tell you some of the things that I've learned, but I can't guarantee that those match the organisation's learning. You know, it is my learning. I can only hope that it matches the organisation's learning. But at best, the learning arising from different kinds of reviews involves learning with and from the individuals concerned and their families. For a very bleak 12 months in my own family's experience, my brother was placed in a unit. He had been in his own accommodation, and it was determined by a psychiatrist, quite independently of the family, that he needed to be given a trial of lithium because of his behaviour. And we were told that he would only be in this particular service for 1 week for the medication to take some effect. After a week, my brother was told that he'd lost his tenancy. And I couldn't make sense of this. At the time, I worked, I wasn't living in the north of England, and I was commuting from London. And I was given times to meet the psychiatrist. I would often receive an email on the Friday to be there at 3 o'clock on the Monday. I had a teaching program at the time. I was teaching, I had students. And I couldn't just drop everything. And similarly, my siblings also had teaching programs. And I was just astonished that the service could be so brutal in, you know, you've got to be there. I was even more astonished some time later when I received correspondence saying that because the family is unwilling to be available, we've appointed an advocate to work on his behalf. And I felt just helpless. So even though I knew a great deal, I thought, about services and service responses to individuals and their families, we were on the losing side against this particular social services. That I'm a bit thin on the detail is really kind of helpful, because I was so absorbed with the horror of my brother's experience and his ultimate double incontinence, by the way. The medication was delivered, he became doubly incontinent, he started to dribble and was very distressed. And yet the line was, this medication, he has to stay on it. And I just recall the weekend he came to stay with me, and I just tipped this stuff down the loo, and it felt so much better because he'd never been on medication previously. And I thought, you are killing my brother. This is just an appalling outcome arising from the investment of a psychiatrist who does not know him and has not been sufficiently interested in engaging with his family, the people who love him to bits. I was told that she was seeing him regularly. We were seeing him probably 4 times a week. Regularly to the psychiatrist was once a month. And there's a lesson, I think, that we don't tend to value. Families can be an extension of your own monitoring, your own eyes and ears. I know we can be absolute nightmares as well, I have to say that. Because if you had stopped me during this very bleak period in my family's life and asked me how I was, I'd have pinned you to the wall for 2 hours and told you. And certainly at that time, I would not have been in a position to undertake any kind of review on behalf of anybody else. I was just too absorbed and distressed by what it was that was happening in my own family to my brother. And because I'm a vindictive woman, I did write about it afterwards, and the article does feature in the Journal of Adult Protection, and it felt better just setting out exactly what had happened. But I also followed up the psychiatrist through the General Medical Council. I made a complaint. And the response, when I think back to it, the response was, the psychiatrist has been told that families are important. And I thought this was a very hard lesson for us, and it should not have been a lesson for her. So there's the bitterness out of the way, but it's also a glimpse of what it was like. And I do recall sometime afterwards, some of the social workers saying, can we meet you and your brother? And let's talk about some of the things that have happened. So very willingly, we went along, and the social worker said, so tell us about it. And I spoke, Peter spoke. And they said, oh, well, we're doing this now. Oh, well, we're doing that now. Oh, well. And I had to say, hang on a minute. He was in this place for 12 months. So please don't pretend or suggest that everything is suddenly better. It's not. And I think I see that pattern played out in reviewing. It's all better now. You know, we've got new management structure. We've developed the policy. We've got a much better policy. We are much more stringent now in our recruitment processes, got a new team. And why should I have any faith in that? Because my experience was so incredibly bleak. So I think, for me, a greater honesty would have made more sense. You know, this went horribly wrong. Gosh, it went horribly wrong. And as a result, we've started doing these things. We don't know whether they work yet. We have to check out. But give us 12 months and we'll tell you if another family reports a similar experience. If they do, then we'll know that we haven't been effective. So that's why, in my experience, safeguarding is an imperfect art. The stakes are really high, the failures are incredibly visible, and complexity is the rule. But after any of these tragedies, families and loved ones are forced to take a hard look at everything, and we do want to know what's happened. That is something that I have found with all families. We want to know exactly what has happened, and exactly what has happened to their relative. I recall one of the families whose relative was at Winterbourne View Hospital. This was our equivalent of your Arras Attractor service. On the television, we witnessed some horrific abuses, and one mother said, "We gave them our most precious person. And look what happened." And the pain encapsulated within that definition of their most precious person, it remains tangible even now. And it was a reminder or confirmation for me that for individuals, and at a different level, it is devastating to know that your relative has been hurt in some way. The relative you know cannot protect themselves. It's devastating to know that they have been hurt. And certainly the consequences of this go far beyond individual suffering. We know too that the scale of abuse is unknown. Why? Because how many of us want to put our hand up and say, yeah, I was scammed. Yes, I was... that happened to me. We know that women and men are incredibly reluctant to come forward and acknowledge that they've been harmed in a relationship. And we know too that the clandestine worlds of abuse are incredibly well served by disbelief and inadequate responses. So those are some of the things that lodge in my memory. Now, I think what I want to do is just to give you a flavour of a couple of reviews and some of the particular insights arising from those, which I hope will make sense to you. Winterbourne View, rather as your own service in Mayo, brought into our own homes some really off-guard incidents, and most particularly the use of restraint by untrained staff, and the very limited means by which untrained staff worked with people with learning disabilities, the complete failure of trained staff to take action to prevent harm, and the absence of both internal and external challenge. So although the regulator was visiting, they would say things like, yeah, they've got a policy on this, yes, they've got a policy on that, yes, the meals look okay, yes, those menus look interesting, yes, people look okay. That apparatus of oversight was completely unequal to exposing the reach of crimes that took place within this service. Or indeed the arbitrary violence and resulting great distress. One of the things that I think Winterbourne View Hospital showed us was that violence works. It certainly subdues people. And one of the families afterwards said that the man who was mostly responsible for harming her son was his care worker. Was the key worker rather, the one who was negotiating with everybody. So, And it's rather like restraint. It's rather like seclusion. It works. It works for a brief period, because for that brief period, someone is overwhelmed, they are distressed. But over time, it doesn't work. It causes yet more distress. And there is always, it seems to me, the continuous possibility of more harm and degradation. I think it doesn't take any great grasp of psychology to know that there are snares when we undertake reviews. Some things are too awful to remember and also too awful to forget. And some of the images that will be lodged in your head from scandals here, and perhaps in the UK as well, they are one heck of a trumpet for this asymmetry of power between adults who are not able to protect themselves and untrained and sometimes trained staff. Families are reminded that this is a service, this is a hospital, this has a specialist staff. Winterbourne View showed us that actually there's nothing could be further from reality. It was a hospital, but the majority of staff were untrained. The majority of staff had no training whatsoever. The only training that they mostly received was actually in how to restrain people. So we shouldn't be too surprised that that was the method that they mostly used. And the people who lived there were chronically underoccupied. There was nothing for anybody to do. Cruelty is about callousness, and there is a great deal of cruelty in some settings. By cruelty, I mean behaviour that results in the foreseeable distress of others, and whether that's ignoring someone, thumping someone, or just giving them a hard time. We know when we have been treated cruelly and certainly disrespectfully. So if there hadn't been a whistleblower at Winterbourne View Hospital and a camera, I think those abuses that we witnessed in our own sitting rooms would have continued. And the exposure of this particular hospital has completely emptied of meaning notions of hospitals being places of healing. We know that Castlebeck, which owned the hospital, wasn't starved of funding. And it was only afterwards that the satirical journal Private Eye did some forensic accountancy work and identified the funding source of that hospital. You may be interested. They wrote in Private Eye in 2012, the company that owns Winterbourne View Hospital, Castlebeck, is itself part of a group called CB Care Limited, which is itself owned via Jersey by Swiss-based private equity group Lydian, backed by a group of Irish billionaires. The process of private equity ownership is that all the money gets whipped out by the bankers and offshore owners as soon as possible. So while CB Care makes healthy operating profits, these disappear in interest payments, leaving the group with hefty annual losses and liabilities exceeding assets by 14 million. And some of the families said, do you know, we were really pleased, we were delighted that health authorities were prepared to pay 3,000, 4,000 every week for our relative, because it seemed to us that they were acknowledging that they were important. And yet, over time, relatives said, when we visited, they said, have you got £20 so they can go swimming and maybe go out for a meal this week? They were living in a very impoverished environment because of the business model behind this particular private hospital. This is getting miserable, isn't it? I suppose it's a reminder we've got to recalibrate our expectations. Certainly all those years ago when I was learning about social care and healthcare, it seemed that we had very neat little pyramids, you know, with the director at the top and someone responsible at the top, and then, you know, the assistants, and then the workers. This is a very different business model. And it's a business model that is, I think, quite scary. In Wales, we had our own scandal that you may be interested to read about. There is an executive summary called In Search of Accountability, and it concerned the GP owners of care homes for older people, care and nursing homes for older people with dementia in South East Wales. It's on the Welsh Government website. It was commissioned by the First Minister, Carwyn Jones, and it concerned Dr. Prana Das and Dr. Nishabita Das, who were the husband and wife GP owners of over 20 homes in the valleys. If you know anything about South East Wales, these are somewhat poor valleys in the country. There had been a police investigation because even in 1995 there was a TV expose of some of the horrors in these homes, but no action was taken. At that time the NHS was regulating its own service. 10 years later the police investigation began. It cost £15 million and there was no outcome in terms of a prosecution. So what did we abstract from that? Well, I say we. This is me and the families, the relatives of people who were harmed in these homes. Harmed insofar as so very many developed necrotic pressure ulcers. They developed UTIs. They were dehydrated. They were admitted to A&E. The bailiffs called at some of the homes because bills were unpaid. The food bill was reduced enormously, so almost without exception, the residents lost a great deal of weight. So the lessons we abstracted from that is that scandals fix nothing permanently. Scandals are a little bit like distress signals. When something horrible happens, you know, the distress signal is there, and the senior politicians will say, we'll learn the lessons. We are going to make sure that we will abstract, you know, what it is, and we will make sure that we put in place measures that this will not happen again. Another lesson is that we really cannot rely on the conscience of care home owners to deliver valued care and support to frail adults, particularly those with dementia. And it's assumed without evidence as acceptable practice to group lots of people together who are assumed to have similar support needs. And I think probably from this in relation, there's something similar to Winterbourne view, is that the public sector should not underwrite companies which have produced considerable rewards for the few at the expense of the many. These companies, this couple made a great deal of money out of providing homes at that time. And yet, private interest pursued at the expense of others has a really long history. We know that. There will always be individuals who will seek personal gain. But that public interest, which matters to all of us, really can't be subordinate to the short-term gains of what I believe to be individuals who are on the make. They are a minority of directors of homes. These people, these older people, as well as some of the people at Winterbourne View, were not seen as critics of poor performance. Although some people at Winterbourne View ran away, they were returned to the hospital. And the question wasn't asked, well, why have they run away? They were returned to the hospital. They were distressed a great deal of the time. Nobody asked the question, well, why are they distressed? Just as some of the older people in these homes, their behaviour confirmed that they were in distress. And there was indeed an inspector who was tenacious in her efforts to require this couple to make positive changes, to buy more food, and actually on one occasion insisted that staff went to Sainsbury's to buy enough food so that people had a meal that evening in one of the homes. And yet she was demonised by this couple, and she was taken off the case. So you can see how powerful interests can play a part in distracting not just managers, but actually obscuring some of the awful consequences of being in these desperate places. I think, I'm looking at my watch, am I okay for a moment or two? Oh, okay. I think probably one of the initial reviews that I undertook in England concerned a man called Stephen Hoskin, who was murdered in Cornwall, and also a man called Michael Gilbert, who was murdered in Luton. Both of those reviews are available on the respective websites of the Safeguarding Adults boards, as we have them in England. And I think one of the things that struck me was the issue of bullying. And isn't this topical even in the press now? I was fascinated to read that even in Westminster, bullying is a problem. I was fascinated to read that Cancer Care UK is not going to fund research where researchers have been bullied in academia, in different academic settings. So although we associate bullying in the general interactions of children and young people, and bullying is something that's generally hidden from adult supervision, we know it, we can call it out when it's there, and we certainly know what it looks like. But bullying was something that Stephen Hoskin experienced from a very young age. And being different in some way is certainly a risk factor for being bullied. And I'm fascinated that almost without exception, both in England and Wales, young people known to safeguarding services, and even those who are seeking to advise safeguarding, say, we want there to be some more work around bullying. It matters to them, and it comes up every year. And it's about being different. I don't know whether you read novels or if you like novels, but there's a fabulous novel by Jodi Picoult called 19 Minutes. And it explores the experience of a young boy and being bullied and the consequences of being bullied. And it's this kid looked conspicuous because I think he had a Mickey Mouse lunch bag or something when nobody else had, or they'd outgrown them. And his peers had matured physically, and he hadn't. And there's a shocking scene that takes 19 minutes within this novel that has implications for the rest of that that man's life. And I'm not suggesting that girls are. We have a very different edge when we bully. We don't tend to lash out or undress each other. However, Margaret Atwood's novel Cat's Eye is a very powerful account of the cruelties that young girls can perpetrate in different settings. And I often think it's novels that tell us a great deal about not just the ambiguity, but also introduce us to some of the dilemmas that do become familiar in our work around safeguarding. I recall when I was in Lancashire that there was a scenario became known to us about a young woman who was in her 20s, and she had a deteriorating neurological condition. And she had indicated to a support worker that she intended to go to Switzerland to take her own life. And the support worker necessarily said, I can't keep this information to myself. I've got to tell others. And she did, and as a result, she was seen by her GP, a psychiatrist, to establish whether she had capacity, mental capacity. and that this was a voluntary decision. She was also offered more support. She was somebody who particularly liked a particular kind of film, so she was offered more time to attend cinemas to see these films. And she said, I know exactly what you're doing. You're trying to make my life more worthwhile, but I've made my decision. And the staff supporting her asked that she at least tell them when she was going to go, because they wanted preparation as well. She didn't, and she did indeed go to Switzerland and took her own life. And I suppose one of the things that I took from that was that we can't rescue people from their capacitated decisions, much as we would like to do so. We absolutely can't do that. And there are no guidelines that will tell you, how to deal with such scenarios. But contact with a person is fundamental, and also the people who love that person to bits. That's really very, very important. Both, back to Stephen, back to Michael Gilbert, both of these men were subject to extraordinary cruelties, and it was the cruelty that I think that we associate with some of the sort of fast-moving thrillers. It's the ease with which individuals overwhelm weak opponents, unlamented, and almost without exception, the people responsible for the cruelties were underperforming, unemployed young people, sort of trapped in a permanent adolescence. And as a result, these two men lost their lives. I think one of the things that I took most particularly from both of their experience and the organisation supporting them was that even if we're only firefighting, and it does feel sometimes as though we're only firefighting, we must act promptly when we know that people are being bullied. We must take action. And it seems to me that the best of safeguarding interventions are those that are really emphatic in protecting people from individuals who would do them harm. When it's particularly difficult, and it was for Stephen and for Michael, is that they prized friendship, and regrettably they were not able to determine the distinction between a reciprocal friendship and a friendship that was, without exception, wholly exploitative. So in conclusion, I think I'm coming to the edge now, you'll be glad to know. In conclusion, there's just a couple of things that have struck me while I've been here. And I've been reading the papers, as I do, and I've been incredibly inspired, even by last night when we met some people who I'd seen out by the river, people wearing orange overalls. And I was nosy enough. That's one of the joys of being a researcher, by the way. You can be legitimately nosy. I just wondered, what on earth are they doing? And they come in and they have coffee in the hotels along the four bridges, apparently here. And they're called Limerick Suicide Watch. And they are part of our network of people who are driven to take action, sometimes because of their own personal experience. They move along the bridges because that's where people typically take their lives. I note from today's paper that there are 11 suicides in Limerick last year. And I asked them, have the suicides reduced? Yes, they have, they said. That's why they do it. It's really important. And that reminded me of two women I met in Cardiff whose sons took their own lives, young men in their early 20s. And one of the things that they are doing is training barbers. And you think, good grief, surely they need e-learning modules. No, they don't. They're training barbers because they said barbers talk to people. Barbers talk to young men, and young men are particularly vulnerable. And you think, bloody hell, that is incredibly inspired. And they are incredibly inspiring women, as I thought some of the people I met last night are. So the task is to put them together They are the Joseph Abraham Foundation in Cardiff, and these people have here in Limerick, the Suicide Watch have their own Facebook page. I'm also interested in this fascinating trial of Michael Ferris, the farmer in is it North Kerry, and I was fascinated that the character of the deceased has been torn to shreds. And that is something that's happened, that families talk about when their relatives are in services where people have been harmed, and the defence of the staff is, oh God, they're difficult people. Bloody hell, you spend time with them, you'll see how difficult they are. That is excruciating for us to hear, that our families are difficult people, when we take no account of the context and the circumstances in which they've been placed. I'm also aware that there is in Dublin a Safe World Summit at which people are talking about domestic violence. This is extending your work, and I think the best of our work nurtures these networks of leaders. Sometimes they're families, sometimes they're self-advocates, and sometimes they're people who are just driven for whatever reason to do what it is they can. Cycle Against Suicide is an annual cycle ride. There are some good people in this world, and we have to keep that in mind, because, by heck, don't we have a very skewed notion sometimes of what the world is like. So, to finish, I think the best of staff, the best of interventions, make things right as often as we can. That's what it is that we can and should be doing. And turning the instinctive care that we have for each other into something that we can value, be proud of, and give hope to all of us. And I'm sorry, I've gone on for too long. Thank you.